Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Unbound, Off Script. I'm your host, Beth Curry. I'm sitting here in my studio today. It's a bit gray outside, a bit still, and I've decided to do something I don't normally do. Not for you guys, but, behind the scenes here. I have an entire queue of episodes ready for recording, but this morning I realized I couldn't do those just yet. I can't get into the headspace to do them. So I had to put them aside because I want to do this. There's something happening right now in this moment, and it's too fresh. And I think, in my opinion, it's too important to schedule for later. I want to talk to you about the last few months, and I guess specifically the last, 7 days of my life. As many of you know, my book, The Other Side of Quiet, is finally real. It's a physical thing. Right now, a very small group of people are actually holding it in their hands, Some of you might be listening to this with the book sitting right beside you on your nightstand. I don't know. But the rest of the world has to wait until March, and that's when the full story comes out on the podcast. But today isn't about the what. It's not a teaser or anything like that. It's kind of more about the how. I think it's about what actually took to tell it and the cost of the ticket to get to the other side of my silence, right? Some of this, I want to start with a confession I've sprinkled into other episodes before. So if you've consistently listened to off-script episodes, you've probably heard me mention here or there little things, about this upcoming season, about my feelings about it and everything like that. I have been utterly, paralyzingly terrified of this process completely. And I want to be specific about that fear too, because we use the word fear, for a lot of things, just kind of flies out of the old mouth. We use it for, the jitters before a public speech or something, or the rush of adrenaline before a big life change. This wasn't that. This wasn't excited, nervous. It wasn't butterflies or anything like that. It was older. It was something older. Hard to explain. In psychology, we talk about somatic memory. Okay. And this is the idea that our bodies store events that our minds kind of aren't ready to process. Does that make sense? This fear kind of lived in my marrow. It lived in that space between my shoulder blades, just that kind of fear that stays in the body a long ass time after the original danger has kind of gone poof and disappeared, right? So it's kind of like a ghost that doesn't know the war is over. For most of my life, I've lived by a very strict and very invisible set of rules, okay? You probably know them. You might even live them too. In a nutshell, don't challenge the narrative. Don't make anybody uncomfortable. Don't take up more space than the chair you're sitting in. Don't speak unless you're 100% certain it's safe, and even then check twice. For a long time, I mistook that silence for some sort of protection. I taught myself that's what it was. I thought if I stayed quiet, I would stay safe. But what I have come to understand very slowly and through a hell of a lot of tears is that that silence wasn't a shield at all. It was a cage. For years I told myself that my quietness was a sign of strength as well, I guess I kind of wore my endurance like some sort of a badge of honor or something. I thought surviving without complaint was some sort of a virtue, being the easy one, the one who didn't cause trouble was the, highest form of character or something. And I want to be kind to that version of myself, of course. In some ways, those beliefs did help me survive. They kept me under the radar when the radar was kind of a dangerous place to be, right? There's this psychological phenomenon called maladaptive coping. So it's when a behavior that saved your life at 10 starts to ruin your life when you're 40. Um, Survival strategies have a way of overstaying their welcome, right? Like they don't just leave because the environment changed, they linger and they harden and they become your entire identity, if that makes sense. So when I finally sat down to write The Other Side of Quiet, I expected to feel this rush of relief, right? I expected the truth setting me free moment that we all see in the movies or whatever, but instead I hit kind of a wall. I experienced this resistance, really, really thick resistance. It felt like walking through deep water or something. Like it was procrastination and sudden inexplicable exhaustion and just this overwhelming sense of dread that kind of felt like this shadow or something following me from room to room, right? There were days I would open the dock on my laptop and my body would react before I, even got started, and my jaw would tense up and my breath would become shallow, kind of just it was just really bad. And that's the nervous system at work. We all know this. My brain knew I was safe, at my desk with a cup of tea, but my body thought I was walking back into the fire. I was trying to protect me by shutting me down. And that's how I knew that this project wasn't just a book about memories. I think I discovered that it was like it was me claiming safety, reclaiming safety. Trauma isn't a straight line. Talk about it a lot. It's not a tidy story, with once upon a time and the end, especially when the events aren't fresh. When decades have passed and trauma returns in fragments, it's what clinicians call implicit memory, right? It's a feeling of panic without a why or a sudden urge to hide without a who. Writing this book really did feel like archaeology. Sometimes I was gently brushing dust off this beautiful forgotten moment. But other days, I was really digging up things that were still sharp and still very, very capable of cutting. And there was so much grief, not just for what happened, but for the girl I was, the version of me that learned far too early how to disappear. Early in the writing process, I did reach a crossroads as well. I've talked about this in other episodes. There was another person in this story, someone deeply private, someone whose presence was essential. If I left him out or if I changed him too much, the truth would become flat, right? It would just be a half truth and nobody wants those. I didn't want them. I didn't, a huge part of my story, huge context, all of this would have been missing. So I did something that terrified me and I asked for permission. And I want to pause here for a second because I think we need to talk about the psychology of agency, okay? This is my story. I own it. I have the right to tell it. But telling a story with integrity kind of means acknowledging the ripple effects, right? It meant opening a door that had been boarded up for decades. It was a difficult conversation. It wasn't a movie moment where, everything is resolved in 3 minutes. It was raw and it was uncomfortable. I've had conversations about this on the podcast, and we will have more. It wasn't an easy decision for him, and it affected him as well when I asked, and I had no idea until we had a conversation about it on the podcast. If you listen to this season, you'll start to understand why this conversation had to happen. And what I can tell you now, obviously, is that he was very supportive, as he always has been. I've known him basically my whole life, and he's always been supportive. And that support, it kind of hit me in a way that I wasn't prepared for. But the most beautiful part of that to me, he told me that this process, me speaking up and me doing this and including him in trying to remember things that I had forgotten, and hearing his side of how things happened, it actually healed a part of him. He didn't even realize he was carrying some sort of a weight until I started to lift my end of it, right? So it turns out that when we find our voice, we often accidentally give others the frequency that they need to find theirs. Now, there's a part of this journey as well that actually started 4 years. Yeah, I've lost all kinds of years. It was started back in 2020. Okay, so 6 years, almost 6 years. The world went quiet in a way that was almost eerie, right? The noise of the hustle stopped. The distractions, the dinners, the errands, the busyness, it kind of all fell away. And in that stillness, the things you've been running from usually catch up to you. I found myself in a position where I had to tell my parents things that I held for over 30 years, things I had convinced myself would destroy them or destroy our relationship. There is a concept called the spotlight effect. It's a kind of psychological bias where we overestimate how much others are noticing our flaws or how much our truth will negatively impact the environment, basically. I spent decades under that spotlight, certain that if I spoke, the whole entire friggin' world would catch fire. I was always bracing for the worst, and I braced for them to look away, to minimize it, maybe to crumble. Instead I was met with a level of understanding that kind of felt like cold water on a burn, And then they told me something I'll never forget as well. They said that by speaking, I had given them a gift. By opening up and telling them things, I had given them a gift. I'd given them clarity for questions they didn't even know how to ask. I had been holding a piece of a puzzle they had been trying to solve for 30 years, right? Because I was their daughter. I was their teenager who they knew damn well was going through some pretty crazy shit. But I had closed off so much, they were so afraid of losing me, they could never ask me for the answers. And I was able to give them to them. And that, I don't know, like that was a huge thing for me and my parents. And I'm so grateful that before my dad died and before my mom started really losing herself to the disease of dementia, I was able to give them that. And you'd think that after that, the fear would go away, right? You'd think, I don't know, the boss level was defeated. But fear isn't rational at all. It's neural circuitry, right? It's a habit. So even after my parents, I was still scared. More recently, I told two of my best friends, women who know my soul, decades-long friendship, literally lifelong friendships. I was convinced that this would be the line, right? I thought, okay, they love me, but this is too much. This is where I'm going to become the broken one or the heavy friend. I prepared to lose them. I literally rehearsed the loneliness. And instead, nothing changed. Or rather, everything changed, but for the better. There was no shock. There was no withdrawal. There was just presence. And it makes me think about attachment theory. We often stay quiet because we're afraid of losing the connection, right? But a connection that requires your silence isn't actually a connection at all. It's a damn hostage situation. So anyway, the last week though, for me, and what prompted me to do this right now this morning has been the most surreal to me. So the limited print run of my books arrived, last week, boxes and boxes of them in my house. And a funny thing happened, people wanted to buy them. Now, look, I know the podcast is free. You're listening to this for free right now. It's going to be free when I literally read this book starting in March to you. But people bought the book anyway. And I don't think they bought it for the information or to get the dirt before everyone else. They bought it as a way of saying, I see you. I'm standing with you. So just in the last couple days, I've been making local deliveries. I'm driving to houses. I'm handing over these physical copies of my heart. And in those brief moments, in driveways, on porches, in the 5 minutes between the handoff and the goodbye, something extraordinary is happening. One of the women took the book and held it to her chest and just whispered, I went through it too. And another one said, me too. Stories I never knew existed, pain that had been mummified in silence for years, suddenly getting some air. These people weren't just buying the book, they were recognizing themselves. Basically in the mirror I was holding up, right? There's a neurological reason for this, mirror neurons. When we witness someone else being brave, our brain literally practices that bravery. Vulnerability is kind of like a social lubricant. It reduces the friction of being human. And by trusting them with my truth, I unwittingly gave them a safe harbor for theirs. And, I've been sitting with a question all last night and even into this morning. why was I so afraid? If the result has been nothing but kindness, support, and healing, why did my body scream at me to stop all these years, Um, the psychological answer, I think it's both simple and devastating. Like I said, when we are silenced early, especially during our formative years, we don't just learn this habit of being quiet, right? Our brain actually builds an association between truth and danger. So we learn that our needs are an inconvenience, right? We learn that our emotions are too much for the adults or the systems around us. We learn that peace, which is actually just the absence of conflict, is more important than truth. So we develop what D.W. Winnicott called the false self. I've talked about it in previous episodes, but in case you didn't listen to that one, the false self is a masterpiece of engineering. Okay. It's agreeable. It's low maintenance. It's the strong one. It's quietly competent. It's designed to ensure that no one ever has a reason to leave us or be angry with us, right? But the cost of the false self is the slow death of the truth self. That's why telling the truth feels like, I don't know, stepping into oncoming traffic, even when the road is empty. Your nervous system doesn't give a shit that the road is empty. It remembers the time you got hit 20 years ago, right? But the secret I've learned is that voice is contagious. So every time I've told my truth, even when I would shake, even when my voice would tremble, I've watched the person across from me exhale. And that exhale is the sound of a nervous system finally feeling safe enough to let down its guard. Silence protects the system. It protects the status quo. It protects the people who don't want to change. But the truth protects the person. Bravery isn't the absence of fear. I think we need to retire that stupid definition. Bravery is speaking while the fear is sitting right there in the room with you. Right? It's acknowledging it. It's thanking it for trying to keep you safe and then speaking anyway. It's choosing your own peace over someone else's comfort, right? It's understanding that silence might feel like a safe house, but it will eventually become a tomb. That's why I named the book The Other Side of Quiet. The other side of quiet isn't a place where the past is gone. It's a place where the past no longer has the power to keep you small. It's a place full of shared humanity. It's a place where me too is the most common phrase spoken. Season 3 of Unbound officially begins in March. To those of you holding the early pages of this book, thank you. Thank you for being my first responders, if you will. To everyone else, stay close. The season isn't just about what happens to me. It's about what happens to all of us when we finally decide to stop being quiet. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for proving to me day after day that the other side of quiet is absolutely a place worth crossing into. I'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit authorbethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.